The day the police stormed into our house, I was still in the kitchen cooking dinner for my wife. Before I could even understand what was happening, handcuffs were locked around my wrists. She was shaking as she pointed straight at me, accusing me of scamming billions and using her name as a cover. I looked into my wife's eyes, waiting, hoping, for a single word in my defense. Instead, I saw only a cold, unsettling calm. The look of someone who had rehearsed this moment for a very long time. If you want to know how this betrayal unfolds and what happens next, subscribe to the channel, hit like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the full story. I got home just after 7, the same way I had for years, easing my truck into the narrow space in front of the row house and killing the engine before the radio finished the song. My day had been split between warehouse schedules, missed shipments, and a long call with a vendor who kept promising fixes that never came. Nothing unusual. That kind of tired settles into your bones after a while and becomes part of how you move through the world. Inside, the house carried on without waiting for me. My son was in his room, door half closed, voice low as he talked into his headset. The television murmured from the living room. My wife stood at the kitchen counter, phone pressed to her ear, nodding at something only she could hear. She raised a finger at me, a quiet signal to wait. I washed my hands and checked the mail spread across the table. Utility bills. A credit card statement I didn't remember opening. An envelope already slid open, my name printed cleanly on the front. I stacked them neatly, the way I always did, and told myself I'd look later. She ended the call and glanced at the pile. "I needed you to sign something today," she said, casual, already turning back to the counter. "What kind of something?" "Just paperwork. You know how this stuff is." The words slid past me like they always had. For years, decisions came to me packaged as small favors. Sign here, cover this for now, help my parents out until next month. Each one felt manageable on its own. Together, they filled every empty space. Dinner moved along in fragments. My son asked about a field trip. I nodded, half listening, thinking about the statement on the table. When I brought it up, my wife waved it off. "It's temporary. I've got it handled." Handled meant she'd spoken to someone I didn't know well enough to trust. Lately, that someone showed up more often. A man from her old circle. Not family, not quite a friend. He dropped by with updates, suggestions, an ease in the house that felt earned without effort. That evening, his name came up again. "He's helping us restructure things," she said. "He knows the system." I asked what things meant. She answered by pushing a folder across the table. My signature line waited at the bottom, blank, patient. "This is our house," I said. "Why is his name anywhere near this?" She looked at me like I'd missed an obvious step. "Don't make this bigger than it is." That tone had become familiar too. Calm, certain, closing doors without slamming them. I scanned the pages, the language dense, the margins tight. Words about access, authority, temporary transfer. Nothing screamed danger. Nothing ever did at first. My son drifted into the kitchen, caught the tension and slowed. "Dad?" I folded the papers and slid them back. "I'll look at it tomorrow." Her jaw tightened, just enough for me to notice. "We don't have tomorrow." The room felt smaller then, not from noise or heat, but from the weight of being the last obstacle. I thought about the overtime I'd worked, the loans I'd co-signed, the quiet promise I'd made to keep everyone steady. Arguing now would only stretch the night longer. So I picked up the pen. The signature came easy. Muscle memory took over, the same way it had on 100 other forms. When I finished, she gathered the pages without a word and carried them down the hall, already dialing her phone. Later, after my son went back to his room and the television clicked off, I stood alone at the sink, rinsing a plate that was already clean. Through the window, the street stayed calm. Porch lights glowed. Someone laughed 2 houses down. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, telling myself I needed air. The door shut behind me with a soft final sound. On the sidewalk, I checked my pockets for my keys, my phone, anything I might have left behind, and started walking toward the corner, still thinking about the pen, the paper, and how natural it had felt to give something away without asking where it was going. The next morning didn't give me time to sort anything out. My phone buzzed before I reached the warehouse, a number I didn't recognize lighting up the screen. I let it ring while I parked, then saw the voicemail notification and listened as I walked. "This is Ms. Harper from Eli's school. We need to talk about some paperwork that came in. Please call me back." Paperwork again. That word had started to follow me. Inside the operations office near the docks, the usual noise moved around me without slowing down. Forklifts passed. Radios crackled. A supervisor waited with a clipboard, asking about a late shipment. I answered on habit, giving instructions, solving small problems the way I always had. The work still made sense. It stayed where you put it. During the morning break, I returned the call. Ms. Harper spoke carefully, like someone trying not to step on a loose board. "There's a change request regarding custody authorization," she said. "Nothing urgent, but we need clarification." I asked who sent it. "It came through your household," she replied, then added, "We just want to make sure everyone's on the same page." I said I'd stop by later. When the call ended, I stayed where I was, phone still in my hand, watching a pallet get wrapped at the far end of the floor. That wasn't something I'd signed, at least, not that I remembered. By lunchtime, word had started to drift. A cousin of Danielle's had called to ask if everything was okay. One of her aunts sent a message that read polite on the surface, but carried a question underneath. Even a neighbor I barely spoke to asked how things were going, eyes lingering a second too long. None of it felt planned. No accusations, just curiosity moving from one person to the next, picking up weight. At work, the shift changed. Conversations quieted when I walked past. A joke died halfway through. Someone avoided meeting my eyes. I hadn't done anything different. Still, the air around me had. I told myself it would pass if I didn't feed it. Problems had a way of burning out when you leading them alone. That belief had carried me far enough before. Near the end of the day, Sophia stopped by my desk. She worked compliance, one floor up, someone who saw paperwork before it became trouble. She didn't smile when she sat down. "You've got a few files flagged," she said, "nothing formal yet." Flagged how? Inconsistent authority. Access changes that don't line up with your role. I leaned back in my chair. "That happens," I said. "People mix things up." She shook her head, slow. "Not like this." Silence stretched between us. She wasn't accusing, she wasn't defending either, just laying out facts. "If I were you," she added, "I'd want copies of everything with my name on it." I nodded, more to end the conversation than because I agreed. Still, the words stayed with me. After work, I drove past the school instead of going home. Ms. Harper met me in the office, folders stacked neatly on her desk. She showed me the form, my signature printed clean at the bottom. The request shifted decision authority. Temporary, according to the language. Necessary, according to the explanation attached. "Is this correct?" she asked. I stared at the paper. The signature looked right. The timing didn't. "I'll check," I said. Back in the car, I didn't start the engine right away. Calls and messages waited on my phone, all circling the same questions without asking them outright. No one was hostile. That was the worst part. Concern has a way of isolating you faster than anger. By the time I reached the house, Danielle was already on another call, pacing the living room. She covered the phone when she saw me. "We'll talk later," she said. I nodded, set my keys on the counter, and went to wash my hands. In the mirror above the sink, the man looking back at me seemed smaller than he had the night before. Not weaker, just quieter. In the hallway, Eli's door was closed. I knocked once, light. "Dinner soon," I said through the wood. No answer came back. I stood there a moment longer than necessary, then turned toward the kitchen, reaching for the stack of mail I'd left unopened that morning. I tore open the first envelope at the counter and let the rest slide into a loose pile. Statements, notices, a confirmation letter that thanked me for authorizing changes I didn't remember approving. The language stayed careful, almost polite. Nothing accused, everything assumed. The next day put me on the road early. A supplier outside Richmond wanted a face-to-face after a scheduling mess, and the drive gave me space I hadn't asked for. Halfway there, the fuel light blinked on. I pulled off at a station near the interstate, the kind where people don't linger unless they have to. Inside, two men stood near the counter, arguing in low voices. I waited behind them, eyes on a rack of snacks, not paying attention until one sentence cut through. "She said he signed it himself," one of them said. "Clean transfer, no questions." "That's not what the bank told me," the other replied. Timing didn't match. They noticed me then and dropped the subject. The cashier rang me up. I nodded, took the receipt, and walked out with the words stuck where I couldn't shake them. Back in the truck, I sat longer than needed, receipt folded between my fingers. The phrase clean transfer echoed, paired with timing didn't match. It wasn't proof. It wasn't even about me. Still, it didn't fit the story I'd been hearing. The meeting went nowhere. Polite talk, no solutions. On the drive back, doubt crept in sideways. Maybe I had signed more than I remembered. Long days blur. Fatigue dulls edges. That explanation worked for a mile or two, then fell apart. I'd always kept track of what carried my name. That habit hadn't vanished overnight. By the time I returned to the office, access had changed. A report I usually reviewed showed as restricted. A shared folder wouldn't open. When I asked IT, they shrugged. Permissions were updated, someone said. Came from higher up. Higher up meant above me, which narrowed the field more than it should have. I stopped bringing things up at home. Questions there turned into detours. Answers arrived pre-packaged, sliding past what I actually asked. Danielle talked about stress, about people interfering, about how complicated everything had become. She didn't mention numbers anymore. Names disappeared from the conversation. So I adjusted. Quietly. Receipts went into a separate folder. Dates got written down. Calls logged with times and who spoke first. I backed up emails before they could be altered, saved copies in places I didn't usually look. None of it felt dramatic. It felt like returning to a skill I'd let rust. At the school, Eli's counselor asked if things were stable at home. The question carried a practiced neutrality that made my throat tighten. I answered carefully, said we were working through logistics. She nodded and handed me a form that needed updating. That evening I noticed a new lock code on the shared account portal. Reset without warning. I didn't push it. I wrote down the time and moved on. Sleep thinned, not from panic, but from the effort of holding too many loose threads at once. In the quiet hours, I replayed the last few weeks, checking memories against documents. Some lined up, others refused. At work, Sophia passed my desk without stopping, then came back. "They're moving faster," she said, voice low. "You're being edged out." "Of what?" "Decisions," she replied. "Visibility." I thanked her and kept my eyes on the screen until she left. That night, the house stayed busy with calls and half conversations. I made dinner, listened to Eli talk about practice, washed dishes after. Between tasks, I slipped a flash drive into my pocket, then another, checking them like keys before heading out to the garage. The routine continued, ordinary on the surface. Underneath, something had shifted. The structure I'd trusted didn't collapse. It thinned, thread by thread, until I could see through it. The letter arrived while I was on the road again, this time asking me to appear at a county administrative office in Richmond. No explanation beyond a reference number and a time slot. I didn't call to ask questions. Questions had started to feel like invitations for someone else to steer the answer. The waiting area stayed quiet, the kind of place built to move people through without conversation. When my name was called, a clerk led me into a small office and slid a document across the desk. "This is a notice of change," she said. "You've been removed as the primary decision holder on several shared assets." I read it once, then again, slower. The language was clean, legal, already processed. "On what grounds?" I asked. She pointed to a line halfway down the page. "Consent and supporting statements." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I asked for copies. She printed them without hesitation. Forms I'd seen before, now filled in differently. Dates aligned just enough to look intentional. Signatures matched mine well enough to pass at a glance. Outside, I sat on a bench and went through every page. One of the supporting statements mentioned concerns about my stability. Another referenced my absence from key decisions. Each sentence read reasonable on its own. Together, they painted a version of me I barely recognized. My phone buzzed. A message from work, asking if I could step into a meeting later that afternoon. No context, just urgency. The meeting wasn't long. 2 managers and someone from corporate compliance sat across from me. Their expressions stayed neutral, professional. "There's been a complaint," one of them said, "about access and authority." "From whom?" I asked. "We can't disclose that." They explained the review process, the temporary reassignment of responsibilities. Words like precaution and standard procedure floated between us. No accusations, no defense to argue against. "You'll retain your position," another added. "For now." I nodded, thanked them, and left with a folder that felt heavier than it looked. Calls started coming in before I reached the parking lot. A lender asking to confirm changes. An automated alert notifying me of a transfer I couldn't stop. Each one took something concrete away. Control, standing, margin for error. At home, Danielle moved through the evening like everything followed plan. She mentioned the meeting before I could bring it up. "This is for the best," she said. Things were getting complicated. "For whom?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she talked about protecting Eli, about making sure decisions were streamlined. Her words stayed calm, reasonable, the same tone that had closed every door before. I didn't accuse. I didn't demand explanations. I asked where the supporting statements came from. "People who care," she said. That night, I logged into accounts that still allowed me access, fewer than before. I downloaded what I could, noted what I couldn't reach. Each denial confirmed the pattern. Eli knocked on my door while I worked. "Mom says we might change schools," he said. "Nothing's changing tonight," I replied. He studied my face, then nodded and went back down the hall. After he left, I sat there longer than planned, listening to the house settle. The losses stacked up quietly. Not everything, enough to hurt. Defending myself hadn't slowed anything down. Staying reasonable hadn't either. I closed the laptop, slid the papers into a folder, and set it by the door. In the kitchen, I poured a glass of water, drank half, then filled it again, already thinking about the calls I needed to make in the morning. Traffic thinned once I cleared the city. The road stretched south toward Raleigh, long enough to let thoughts surface without being invited. I drove with the radio off, hands steady on the wheel, eyes forward. Somewhere between exits, a detail from years ago slipped back into place. Danielle had once asked me to sign a limited power form during a renovation. I remembered because I'd hesitated then too. The contractor wanted one contact, she'd said. Temporary. I'd signed, watched her tuck the paper into a folder, and forgot about it the same day. The memory returned now with edges sharpened by everything that followed. Temporary had never meant what I thought it did. I pulled over at a rest stop and checked the copies I'd brought along. Dates lined up closer than comfort allowed. The wording matched the old form almost exactly. Authority expanded through add-ons, each justified as routine. No single document crossed a line. Together, they erased it. My phone vibrated. Sophia's name came up. "You still driving?" she asked. "For a bit." "Good. Don't rush this." She didn't ask how I was holding up. She never did. "What am I missing?" I said. "Why you're the quiet one," she replied. "People assume silence means agreement. They build around that. And if I speak, then you change the shape of the room," she said. "But only if you're clear about what you want back." The question stayed with me after the call ended. What did I want back? Control sounded abstract until I pictured Eli's face when he asked about changing schools, until I thought about opening accounts that no longer recognized me. Safety through compliance had cost more than it saved. By the time I reached Raleigh, messages stacked up. Some came dressed as concern. Others hid behind policy. A few didn't bother pretending. A relative suggested I step aside for everyone's sake. A colleague warned me to keep my head down. Advice traveled faster than facts. Danielle didn't call. Instead, a mutual friend sent a text asking if the rumors were true. I asked which ones. No reply followed. That evening, I checked into a small hotel near the office park and laid everything out across the desk. Papers, drives, notes. Patterns emerged once I stopped hoping they wouldn't. Decisions that cut me out. Stories that framed those decisions as necessary. Timing arranged to make objections look reactive. The next morning confirmed it. An email circulated at work outlining interim leadership adjustments. My role stayed intact on paper. Influence shifted elsewhere. Meetings moved without notice. Access tightened another notch. At lunch, Sophia joined me without asking. "They're consolidating," she said. "If you wait, they'll finish." "And if I don't?" "Then you make it formal," she replied. "Documentation, counsel, boundaries." I stared at the menu without reading it. "They'll say I'm escalating." "They already did," she said. "You just didn't hear it directly." That afternoon, I called a number I'd saved weeks ago and never used. The consultation stayed brief, factual, expensive, necessary. Back at the hotel, I sorted through my notes again, this time discarding what didn't matter. Emotion had crowded the edges. I trimmed it away. What remained fit together cleanly. Danielle left a voicemail near midnight. "We need to talk," she said. "This is getting out of hand." I listened once and deleted it. Not out of spite, out of clarity. In the morning, I dressed early, packed my bag, and checked out. Before heading to the office, I stopped by a print shop and made copies of everything worth keeping. The clerk asked if I needed staples. I said no. I drove with the windows up, phone face down on the seat beside me. At a red light, I took the folder from the passenger side, slid it into my briefcase, and reached for the ignition as the light changed. Morning routines settled into something precise. Coffee brewed while files opened. Notes lined up beside the laptop. I stopped trying to absorb everything at once and worked in passes, checking dates first, then signatures, then the order in which permissions shifted. Patterns don't announce themselves. They wait for patience. Raleigh helped in that way. Fewer interruptions, less history attached to each corner. I spent hours cross-referencing statements with email timestamps, matching authorization trails to calendar entries. When something didn't fit, I flagged it and moved on instead of forcing an answer. The gaps mattered more than the confirmations. By midday, the work turned mechanical. Save, label, backup, repeat. Emotion dulled as the process took over. That change didn't feel like numbness. It felt like control returning in small increments. A call came through from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Another followed 10 minutes later. Same prefix, different last digits. I silenced the phone and kept working. When I checked later, neither message said much, just a pause, then a hang-up. The timing felt deliberate. At the office, access logs updated without notice. Someone had attempted to open a folder I'd restricted the night before. The request failed. I noted the time and the IP range, then closed the alert. Nothing to confront yet. Sophia stopped by after lunch, stood in the doorway without sitting. "You're being watched," she said, softly, for now. "By whom?" "Anyone who thinks you won't notice." She scanned the room, then lowered her voice. "Keep your movements boring," she added. "No sudden changes." I smiled without humor. "That I can do." The afternoon passed with small adjustments. I rerouted backups, changed passwords on accounts that still recognized me, created redundancies that didn't rely on a single device or location. Each step stayed within policy. Quiet compliance can still be firm. On the drive back to the hotel, a car followed for 3 lights, then turned off. Coincidence? Maybe. I didn't slow down to test it. I took a longer route instead, stopping at a grocery store I didn't need, buying nothing, walking out through a different entrance. No one lingered behind me. Danielle texted once, a short line asking when I'd be home. I didn't answer. Not yet. That evening, I reviewed phone records and noticed an anomaly. A call routed through a forwarding service during a window when I'd been logged into a system from a different state. The overlap couldn't be explained by error. I added it to the list and kept going. Eli sent a message from his tablet. "Practice ran late. Dinner's in the fridge," I replied. "Heat it up." "You okay?" I stared at the screen longer than necessary. "I'm fine," I typed, then erased it, rewrote. "I'm working." "Okay." The exchange ended there. It was enough. Near midnight, the hotel's Wi-Fi cut out for a few minutes. When it returned, a login attempt pinged my phone. Someone had guessed close, not exact. That suggested familiarity, not luck. I disabled remote access and packed the drives into a smaller case I could keep with me. Sleep came in shallow waves, not from fear, but from calculation. I woke early and wrote out a timeline on paper, pen moving faster than thought. Seeing it laid out flattened the noise. The story stopped changing shape once the order settled. At breakfast, I overheard a conversation at the next table about a legal dispute that had gone sideways because someone waited too long to speak. I didn't look over. I finished my coffee and left. Back at the office, a calendar invite appeared for a meeting I hadn't requested. Mandatory. Short notice. The agenda listed clarifications. I declined and sent a note asking for reschedule through counsel. The reply came back within minutes, polite and tight. Noted. That word carries weight when it arrives early. By late afternoon, another attempt hit the restricted folder, this time from a different network. I exported the logs and added them to the growing archive. No commentary, just facts. I drove as the sky dimmed, phone face down, mind steady. At a stoplight, I checked the rear view out of habit, then focused ahead. The light changed. The car rolled forward. My hand tightened briefly on the wheel, then relaxed as I merged back into traffic, already deciding which file to open first when I got back. The summons came through an official channel, stamped and neutral, directing me to a county building outside Raleigh before noon. No accusations spelled out, just a requirement to appear. I dressed the way I always did for work, not out of confidence but habit, and drove there with the folder on the passenger seat. Inside, the process moved faster than expected. A clerk checked my ID, handed me a badge, and pointed down a hall where doors stayed closed. When I was called in, 2 people sat across the table, files already open. A third joined by phone, voice filtered and distant. "We need clarification regarding several authorizations," one of them said. "There are concerns about misuse of access." I listened without interrupting. Questions came in a steady rhythm, each framed as routine. Dates, transfers, decision thresholds. I answered with facts and pointed to documentation when needed. That part held. Then a different folder slid across. "This statement alleges coercion," the voice on the phone said, "and concealment." I recognized the phrasing immediately. The words had been lifted from conversations meant to stay private, reassembled into something colder. My responses slowed, not from confusion, but from the realization that the ground had shifted beneath the room. "Who submitted this?" I asked. "We can't disclose sources during an active review." Active review turned into a pause while they stepped out. The door didn't fully close. I could hear a phone ring, voices lowered, then footsteps returning. "Based on the materials," the clerk said, "we're initiating a temporary hold on your access pending further investigation." "A hold on what?" I asked. "Financial instruments, property-related decisions. Not custody, not yet, but close enough to feel the pull." My phone vibrated. A message from the school, then another. I didn't check them. I signed where instructed, hands steady, and stood when they told me I could leave. Halfway down the hall, 2 uniformed officers stepped in front of me. "Sir," one said, "we need you to come with us." The words didn't land all at once. They stacked. A complaint had escalated. A warrant authorized detention for questioning related to alleged fraud. The phrasing stayed clinical, careful to avoid conclusions while stripping me of options. I asked to call my son. They said later. In a small room that smelled of disinfectant and paper, my belt and watch went into a tray. I focused on Eli's last message from the night before, the casual way he'd said okay. The image held me upright while time slipped sideways. Danielle called while my phone sat sealed in a bag. I saw the missed call afterward, along with 3 messages I didn't open. Sophia's name appeared too, once, then again. I held on to that without knowing why. Hours passed, or minutes. Hard to tell when clocks aren't yours. A public defender introduced herself and spoke quickly. Allegations, circumstantial evidence, conflicting records. Nothing conclusive, she said. Not enough to clear me either. Bail would be considered later. For now, holding. "You can fight this," she added, "but it won't be clean." They moved me to a holding area with benches bolted to the floor. Another man sat across, eyes down. No one spoke. I replayed the last few months, not to assign blame, but to trace where silence had become permission. A guard announced my name. Paperwork again. Fingerprints. A photograph I didn't see. When it ended, I asked one question. "Can I call my son?" He shook his head, not unkind. Back on the bench, a thought settled in without panic. Waiting had always been my strategy. Enduring. Letting storms pass. That approach had carried me here, stripped of voice and choice. When they stood me up again, I followed without resistance. The hallway bent left, then right. Doors opened and closed. Somewhere behind the noise, a decision clicked into place. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear enough to change how I would answer the next question, whenever it came. They transferred me to Wilmington after 2 nights that blurred together. A temporary hold, they said. Space issues. I didn't argue. Movement meant time, and time meant chances. The meeting happened in a small office near the river, arranged through my attorney, without much explanation. I sat across from a man who kept his hands folded, eyes fixed on the table until introductions ended. He worked maintenance for a financial services firm, connected to one of the accounts that had flagged my name. I wasn't supposed to be in that system, he said, but I was covering a shift. His voice didn't shake. It carried the calm of someone who'd already decided to tell the truth. He explained how an access request came through after hours, routed under a legacy authorization code. The name attached wasn't mine. It belonged to a shell entity that looked inactive unless you knew where to check. He'd logged it because the timestamp conflicted with the region listed on the request. I flagged it, he said. Got told to drop it. I asked who told him. Didn't come from you, he replied. Came from someone who expected you not to be looking. That sentence landed without drama. It fit too cleanly to ignore. Documents followed. Logs, screenshots, a brief statement he'd kept copies of against policy because something felt off. None of it proved everything. Enough of it proved something important. My access couldn't have been used the way they claimed, not at the times they listed, not from the places they named. Back at the holding facility, messages filtered through counsel. Danielle had filed another statement, this one longer, more emotional. She spoke about fear, about control, about protecting our son. The language softened the edges while sharpening the accusation. Each paragraph assumed I'd stay quiet long enough for it to stand. I didn't. Sophia called that evening, voice steady. They overplayed it, she said. They assumed you'd keep absorbing. They assumed right, I replied. Not anymore. She walked me through the sequence I'd already started mapping, where the requests originated, how the timing forced conclusions before responses could catch up. The strategy relied on momentum, not proof. They need you passive, she added. The minute you push back, the structure shows. The next step took place without fanfare. My attorney filed motions tied to jurisdiction and access inconsistencies. Not accusations. Questions that demanded answers under oath. That changed the tone. Reactions came fast. Public statements framed me as unstable. A comment appeared online questioning my fitness as a parent. Each one aimed to pull me back into defense. I let them hang. In Wilmington, I reviewed the material again, this time arranging it by dependency instead of date. Which claims required which assumptions? Which statements collapsed if a single log proved false? The pattern pointed to confidence, not caution. Whoever built it believed I wouldn't surface long enough to challenge it. A guard knocked to announce a call. It was brief. Bail hearing scheduled. New evidence entered the record. No guarantees. Afterward, I sat on the edge of the cot and wrote out a short list by hand. Names, systems, times. Not a plan yet, just the outline of one. The river stayed out of sight, but I could hear activity beyond the walls. Boats moving, people talking, life continuing without waiting for resolution. That steadied me. When lights dimmed, I lay back and closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to rehearse the order in which things would be said once I stood in a room where silence no longer protected anyone. The courtroom ran on schedule, which meant no one waited for feelings to catch up. I took my seat beside my attorney and kept my hands still on the table. Across the aisle, Danielle sat with her counsel, posture composed, eyes forward. The space between us felt practical, measured in steps and procedure. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Everyone sat. The clerk read the case number, the charges, the scope. Words I'd heard before, now anchored to a room where every sentence counted. The state went first. Their outlines stayed tight. Transfers, access, alleged pressure. They introduced statements that framed me as controlling, erratic, absent when it mattered. Danielle's affidavit carried weight because it read as concern, not accusation. I recognized phrases pulled from arguments we'd had in the kitchen, softened and rearranged until they sounded like policy. When my attorney rose, the tone didn't shift. It narrowed. He asked about timestamps, about locations, about the routing of authorization codes. The state's witness answered confidently at first, then paused when logs appeared on the screen. The dates didn't align with my travel records. The IP addresses didn't match my devices. The room leaned in without moving. Danielle's attorney objected. The judge overruled and asked for clarification. That pattern repeated. Each objection slowed things down. Each answer sped them back up. When my name came up, I stood. The oath felt familiar enough to steady me. Questions followed, direct and plain. Where was I on the night of the transfer? How did I typically authorize changes? Who had access to my credentials? I answered without color, without adding what wasn't asked. Then came the cross. Danielle's attorney aimed for character, not data. He asked about long hours, about missed dinners, about the strain of responsibility. He asked whether I could be intimidating without realizing it. No, I said. I can be quiet. The judge looked up. Explain. I don't raise my voice, I said. I don't threaten. I absorb. That doesn't give anyone authority to speak for me. A murmur traveled and settled. The final push came fast. A document appeared that claimed I'd authorized a critical change from a location I couldn't have been in. For a moment, the room held its breath. My attorney didn't object. He waited. May I? He asked the judge. Permission granted. He introduced a witness. The maintenance technician from Wilmington took the stand. Hands folded, voice even. He explained the legacy code, the after-hours request, the flag he'd raised and been told to drop. He pointed to the log that placed the access outside my reach. Danielle's attorney pressed him. Policy violations. Motive. He didn't bend. I kept the copy because it didn't make sense, the witness said. It still doesn't. The judge asked a question of her own, then another. The answers lined up. The state requested a recess. It was denied. Danielle spoke next. Her voice wavered when she talked about fear, about protecting our son. I watched her choose words carefully, staying within the lane she'd built. When questions turned to timing and systems, that care slipped. Confidence carried her past the edge of what she could support. You expected him not to contest, my attorney said. I expected him to cooperate, she replied. By staying silent? No answer came right away. When the judge spoke, it wasn't loud. Findings never are. The evidence failed to support the state's claims as presented. The access trail contradicted the allegations. Statements relying on assumptions were struck. The matter would proceed on revised terms, with sanctions considered for misrepresentation. Danielle's counsel whispered. She stared straight ahead. As people stood and gathered papers, the room released its grip. I didn't look back. I signed where required, accepted the return of personal items, and stepped into the hallway with my attorney. We're not done, he said. I know. Down the corridor, Sophia waited near a water fountain, arms crossed. She nodded once. No congratulations, no relief speech, just acknowledgement. Outside, the air moved. Phones buzzed. Someone asked for comment. I shook my head and kept walking, the sound of footsteps pacing me toward the exit. At the curb, my attorney handed me a copy of the order. I folded it and slipped it into my jacket without reading it again, then reached for my phone and opened a blank message, thinking about the first call I needed to make as the light changed and traffic edged forward. The apartment sat a few blocks from the water, small enough that every sound carried. I chose it because nothing in it belonged to my old life. No shared lease, no forwarded mail, no neighbor who knew my name. The key turned easily the first night, and that felt like permission. Boxes stayed unpacked longer than necessary. I kept only what I needed within reach. Clothes for the week, a kettle, a folder that no longer grew thicker. Mornings came without urgency. Coffee, a short walk, then work done remotely for a firm that asked questions only when answers mattered. The pace suited me. From the window, I could see people passing with their routines intact. Fishermen loading coolers, a woman jogging with a dog that pulled too hard. I didn't envy them. I just noticed how little explanation any of it required. Eli called on the third day. His voice sounded steadier than I expected. They told us I'm staying put, he said. School's the same. Good, I replied. Mom's busy, he added, then stopped. I waited. She says you're away. I am, I said, but I'm here. He asked about practice, about a tournament coming up. I answered what I could. When the call ended, I set the phone down and let the quiet settle back into place. News traveled without asking me to follow it. Filings became hearings. Hearings became outcomes. The language stayed dry. Sanctions for misrepresentation. Reviews initiated. Assets frozen pending further determination. Danielle's name appeared in contexts it never had before. Not as my wife, as a party. Sophia visited once, sat at the small table with a paper cup between her hands. "You did what you needed to," she said. "I did what was available," I replied. She nodded, satisfied with the distinction. "They won't stop trying to reframe it," she added. "They always do." "They can," I said. "I'm done answering." She stood, adjusted her jacket, and paused at the door. "That boundary," she said. "Keep it." After she left, I washed the cup and set it upside down to dry. I avoided places that invited memory. No revisiting, no checking old roots. When paperwork arrived, I signed only what carried my name and my interest alone. When messages came from mutual contacts, I returned none that circled back to the same questions. Silence did its work without being asked. One afternoon, a letter arrived forwarded from the old address. Danielle's handwriting filled the envelope. I didn't open it right away. Later, I read it once, folded it back into itself, and placed it in the drawer with the rest. The words tried for understanding, then apology, then necessity. None of them asked for permission. I closed the drawer. The hearing that finalized things took less time than expected. I attended by video, camera on, answers brief. No speeches, no closing statements. Orders issued. Responsibilities reassigned. A marriage reduced to terms that no longer required interpretation. When it ended, I logged off and stood from the chair. The room stayed quiet. The kettle whistled from the kitchen. I poured water over grounds and watched the steam rise, then fade. Evenings grew easier, not lighter. Easier. The difference mattered. I learned which hours carried the most noise and planned around them. I learned when to stop reading and start moving. Long walks helped. Not to think things through, but to let them pass. Eli visited during spring break. We cooked together, burned the first batch, laughed at it, tried again. He asked questions I answered honestly, without dragging him through the details. He slept on the couch and left his shoes by the door. When he left, the place returned to its shape without effort. The last task took place on an ordinary morning. I packed the folder that had followed me through every turn and drove it to a secure drop where my attorney would collect it later. Nothing ceremonial, just a handoff. On the way back, I stopped for groceries, choosing what fit the week instead of the past. At the apartment, I put the food away, wiped the counter, and checked the calendar. No hearings scheduled, no calls pending. I set my phone face down and stepped outside with my keys in hand, locking the door behind me before heading down the stairs toward the street, already thinking about dinner and the short walk I'd take before it got dark.